Elderly woman, left alone. In nursing home, what she sees at night will haunt you. Margaret Winters sat motionless in her wheelchair, staring out the window of room 237 at Evergreen Pines Care Center. Her wrinkled hands trembled as she watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sterile walls with long, twisted shadows. She knew what was coming. They always came after dark. The staff had ignored her warnings, dismissed the scratching sounds in the walls as settling pipes, explained away the dark figures that crept past her door as tricks of the light. But Margaret knew better. Last night, she'd seen them clearly for the first time, ghastly faces peering from the mirror, beckoning her with skeletal fingers. Something evil dwelled within these walls, and she alone could see it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The framed doctorate on Margaret's wall had gathered a thin film of dust, barely visible in the dim fluorescent lighting of room 237. It hung there like a relic of a different life, when she was Dr. Margaret Winters, respected professor of psychology. At Berkeley, not just the difficult patient in 237, as she'd overheard the nurses say. 30 years of teaching had earned her that diploma, along with a shelf of published papers and a respected position in her field. Her research on trauma and memory had changed lives, helped countless patients overcome their darkest fears. Now the irony wasn't lost on her. Here she sat, trapped in her own mind, or so they claimed. The stroke had come without warning during her final lecture before retirement. One moment she was explaining cognitive behavioral therapy to a hall full of eager students. The next, the world tilted sideways, and her words became a jumbled mess. She remembered the horrified faces of her students, the rush of paramedics, and then darkness. Recovery had been slow, painful, and incomplete. Her right side remained weaker than her left. Her once precise speech now occasionally stumbled. But her mind remained sharp as ever, despite what her children believed. Thomas and Sarah, her beloved twins, now successful professionals, in their 40s, had made the decision for her own good. "Mom, you can't live alone anymore," Thomas had said, his corporate lawyer voice smooth with practiced concern. "What if you fall? What if you have another stroke?" Sarah, ever the pragmatic surgeon, had added clinical distance to their verdict. "The facility has an excellent rating, Mother. 24-hour care, physical therapy, social activities. It's the logical choice." They'd packed up her life in neat labeled boxes, her books, her research notes, her memories, all stored away in a climate-controlled unit she'd never see again. Photos of her late husband James, gone 5 years now, relegated to a single silver frame beside her bed. The rest of her possessions distributed among family members or donated. Her independence dissolved with each passing day. The first few months, they'd visited regularly. Thomas brought his children, though they squirmed uncomfortably in the presence of illness and age. Sarah came between surgeries, her white coat exchanged for casual wear that somehow still smelled of hospital antiseptic. But gradually, the visits grew shorter, less frequent. Work commitments, school events, family vacations, there was always a reason. Now, sitting in her wheelchair by the window, Margaret tracked their absences in the changing seasons outside. Spring blossoms had given way to summer heat, then autumn, leaves, and finally winter frost. Their calls became perfunctory, holiday obligations marked on a calendar. She heard the guilt in their voices, saw it in the expensive gifts they sent in lieu of visits, top-of-the-line tablets she couldn't operate with her trembling hands, luxury toiletries that sat unused on her bathroom shelf. The true pain wasn't in their absence, but in their dismissal. When she'd first mentioned the strange occurrences, the whispers in the halls, the shadows that moved against the laws of physics, they'd exchanged that look, the one that said, "Mom's losing it." The same look they'd given each other when she insisted someone was stealing her jewelry, only to find her pearl necklace in her own drawer days later, though she was certain she'd checked there multiple times. It's normal to feel disoriented in a new environment, Sarah had explained, her doctor voice taking over. The medications can cause confusion. Maybe we should talk to Dr. Harrison about adjusting your dosage. But Margaret knew the difference between confusion and reality. She'd spent her career studying the human mind, its tricks and deceptions. This was different. The shadows that crept beneath her door at night didn't come from her imagination. The whispers that carried through the air vents spoke words no medication could invent. Something was wrong at Evergreen Pines, and her professional training told her to trust her instincts. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Dinner time, Mrs. Winters," called Nurse Sarah Chen, one of the few staff members who still treated her with genuine kindness. "Would you like to eat in the dining room tonight?" Margaret turned her wheelchair away from the window, where the last rays of sunlight were fading. Soon the night would come, and with it the things that no one else would acknowledge. "Yes," she said quietly, gathering her strength. "I think I'd better." The dining room at Evergreen Pines embodied everything Margaret had come to hate about institutional living. The walls were painted an artificial sage green that someone had decided would be calming. Round tables dotted the space, each adorned with plastic flowers in various stages of dust collection. The room smelled perpetually of disinfectant masked by artificial vanilla, a cloying combination that did nothing to disguise the underlying scent of decay and medicine. Nurse Sarah wheeled her to her usual spot, table 6, where 3 other residents sat in various states of awareness. Herbert dozed in his chair, his head lolling forward, occasionally jerking up only to drift off again. Dorothy methodically stirred her soup without eating it, her rheumy eyes fixed on some distant point. Only Eleanor seemed present, offering Margaret a knowing look as she approached. "Evening, Margaret," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the refined accent of old money and finishing schools. "The Salisbury steak looks particularly mysterious tonight." Margaret managed a small smile. Eleanor had become her closest ally in this sterile prison, the only other resident who seemed to notice the oddities that plagued the facility. At 87, she retained both her sharp wit and her ability to see through the staff's practiced pleasantries. "Time for medications, everyone," announced Nurse Rachel, a heavy-set woman whose cheerful demeanor never quite reached her eyes. She moved around the table, distributing small paper cups filled with pills of various colors and sizes. Margaret noted how Rachel's hand trembled slightly as she approached Eleanor's seat. The staff always seemed uneasy around Eleanor, though Margaret had yet to understand why. As Rachel moved away, Eleanor leaned closer to Margaret. "Did you hear it last night? The singing." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "At around 2 a.m., like a choir, but wrong," Eleanor finished. "All wrong. The words weren't right, weren't even human." Before Margaret could respond, Dr. Harrison appeared at their table, his tall frame casting a shadow over their conversation. The facility's head physician wore his authority like expensive cologne, overwhelming and artificial. His perfectly pressed white coat and carefully styled silver hair projected an image of competence and care, but Margaret had seen how his smile never warmed his steel-grey eyes. "Ladies," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone, medical, "professionals reserved for difficult patients. I trust we're enjoying our dinner. Mrs. Winters, I noticed you haven't touched your medication." Margaret glanced at the small paper cup by her plate. The pills inside were different tonight. One was a deep purple she'd never seen before. "These aren't my usual medications," she said carefully. "We've adjusted your prescription slightly," Dr. Harrison replied smoothly. "Nothing to be concerned about. Just a mild sedative to help with your anxiety about nighttime disturbances." Eleanor's fork clattered against her plate. "She doesn't need sedatives, Harrison. She needs someone to listen." "Mrs. Blackwood." Dr. Harrison cut in, his tone sharpening. "Remember our discussion about agitating other patients? Nurse Rachel, please make sure both Mrs. Winters and Mrs. Blackwood take their medications. We wouldn't want to have another incident." As he strode away, Margaret watched Eleanor's face tighten with barely contained fury. Something passed between the two women, an understanding that went beyond words. Neither touched their medications. The evening shift brought Mike Ramirez, an orderly whose night rounds always seemed to coincide with the strange occurrences. Margaret had noticed how he avoided certain corridors, how he would rush past room 207, now empty, without ever glancing at its door. Tonight, he moved through the dining room with his usual nervous energy, his dark eyes darting to the windows as twilight deepened outside. "Time to head back to your rooms, ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying a slight tremor. "It's going to be dark soon." As Nurse Sarah began wheeling residents back to their rooms, Margaret caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. Through the dining room's large windows, a figure stood in the garden, impossibly tall and thin, its form seemingly bent at unnatural angles. As she stared, it turned its head toward her, revealing a face that seemed to be nothing but shadows and sharp angles. "Did you see?" she began, turning to Eleanor, but her friend was already being wheeled away by Rachel, leaving her question unfinished. Back in her room, Margaret watched as Nurse Sarah efficiently went through the evening routine, checking vital signs, adjusting pillows, ensuring the call button was within reach. Unlike the other staff, Sarah's kindness felt genuine, her gentle hands and soft voice a contrast to the facility's institutional coldness. "Sarah," Margaret said as the nurse prepared to leave, "have you ever noticed anything strange here at night?" Sarah's hands stilled for a moment as she adjusted the blanket. "What do you mean, Mrs. Winters?" "The singing, the shadows, the way some rooms feel wrong." Margaret searched the young nurse's face for any sign of recognition. Sarah's expression remained carefully neutral, but her eyes flicked briefly to the corner of the room, the corner where Margaret had seen the shadows. "Gather. Try to get some sleep, Mrs. Winters. I'll see you in the morning." As Sarah left, switching off the main light and leaving only the small bathroom nightlight glowing, Margaret could have sworn she heard her whisper something under her breath, a prayer, perhaps, or a ward against evil. The night settled over Evergreen Pines like a heavy blanket, bringing with it the sounds that the day shift never heard, the soft scraping in the walls, the distant echoes of footsteps in empty corridors, and underneath it all, the faint beginning of that terrible, beautiful singing. The digital clock by Margaret's bed clicked to 2:37 a.m., its red numbers casting a bloody glow across her blanket. She hadn't slept, couldn't sleep, not after what she'd seen in the garden. The singing had started an hour ago, drifting through the building like smoke, making her skin prickle with its wrongness. A sound at her door made her freeze. Not the usual squeak of nurses doing their rounds, but a slow, deliberate scraping, like bones dragging across linoleum. The handle turned. She'd watched Mike lock it during final checks, but now it opened without resistance. The figure that entered wasn't human. It wore the shape of a nurse's uniform, but its proportions were wrong, limbs too long and bent at impossible angles. Its head nearly brushed the ceiling as it glided toward her bed, moving with a fluid grace that defied physics. Margaret's training kicked in, years of maintaining composure while patients described their worst traumas. She forced herself to lie still, to keep her breathing steady, even as her heart thundered in her chest. The thing stopped beside her and the smell hit her, antiseptic mixed with something older, like grave dirt and moldering bandages. A hand, cold, so cold, brushed her forehead. The touch sent images flooding into her mind. Rows of iron beds, patients strapped down, screaming as shadowy figures performed unspeakable procedures. This building, but older, its walls stained with decades of suffering. The door creaked again, and Margaret heard shuffling footsteps. "Room 237, ready for processing," a voice whispered, familiar yet distorted as if speaking through water. Mike's voice, but wrong. "No," another voice answered, Eleanor's, sharp and clear. "Not this one, she sees." The cold hand withdrew. Margaret forced her eyes open, watching as the twisted figure turned toward Eleanor, who stood in the doorway clutching a tarnished silver cross. The entity moved like liquid shadow, its form rippling as it approached Eleanor. "You cannot interfere again, Blackwood," Mike's distorted voice said. "The harvest must continue." Eleanor's laugh was bitter. "I've interfered for 30 years, you abomination. I'll not stop now." She raised the cross, and for a moment it gleamed with an inner light. The figure recoiled, its form dissipating like smoke, leaving only Mike standing there, his face twisted in an expression of inhuman rage. "Get out," Eleanor commanded, her aristocratic voice ringing with authority. "Or I'll show them what I found in the basement archives." Mike's face smoothed into its usual nervous mask. He backed away, nearly running as he disappeared down the hall. Eleanor stepped into Margaret's room, closing the door behind her. "Well," she said, settling into the visitor's chair with remarkable composure, "I suppose we should talk." Margaret sat up, her hands shaking as she switched on the bedside lamp. What was that thing? The remnants of something that should have died decades ago, Eleanor said, her fingers absently tracing the cross's worn surface. This place. It wasn't always Evergreen Pines. Before the renovations, the new paint, the fancy brochures, this was Ravencrest Psychiatric Hospital. Some very bad things happened here, Margaret. Things that left stains no amount of remodeling can cover. Margaret's academic mind latched onto the mystery, a welcome distraction from the horror. The singing, the figures, they're connected to the old hospital. More than connected. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. They're continuing what they started back then. Different methods, same goal. They harvest something from us. Something vital. The weak ones go first. The ones without families, without visitors. Haven't you noticed how many peaceful passings? In their sleep we have here. A memory surfaced. Her old roommate, Mrs. Chen, no relation to Nurse Sarah. How she'd complained about the singing, about cold hands touching her in the night. 3 days later, she'd been found dead in her bed, her face frozen in an expression of terror that the staff quickly explained away as a stroke. "My dear," Eleanor continued, reaching for Margaret's trembling hand, "they've been doing this for generations, but they didn't count on someone like you coming here, someone with both the training to understand and the strength to see." Margaret pulled her hand away, wheeling herself to the window. In the parking lot below, she saw Mike hurrying to his car, looking over his shoulder repeatedly. "Why are you telling me this? Why now?" "Because I'm dying," Eleanor said simply. "Not their kind of death. Natural causes, can you imagine? The irony. I've held them back as much as I could, protected who I could. But I need someone to continue, someone they haven't corrupted. Someone who understands both the human mind and the things that exist beyond it." A flash of movement caught Margaret's eye, another impossibly tall figure gliding between the cars, following Mike. In the distance, the singing grew louder, and now she could almost make out the words, ancient, terrible words that made her bones ache. "I found something," Eleanor said, pulling a folded paper from her robe pocket. "In a forgotten filing cabinet in the East Wing storage room, records from the old hospital, including—" She broke off, coughing. When she caught her breath, she pressed the paper into Margaret's hand. "Including why they chose this building, what they're really doing with the life force they steal. Look at the patient records from 1954. Look for Dr. Harrison's grandfather." The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. "Dr. Harrison, he's part of this, part of whatever they were doing back then." "Third generation," Eleanor confirmed. "The resemblance to his grandfather is quite striking, although the original Dr. Harrison had more success with his experiments. Success being a relative term when you're trying to achieve immortality through supernatural means." Margaret unfolded the paper with shaking hands, but before she could read it, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Normal footsteps, accompanied by the squeak of rubber soles. Eleanor quickly stood. "Nurse Rachel's rounds," she whispered. "Remember, the East Wing storage room. And Margaret, don't take any new medications they give you. They're not for your health." As Eleanor slipped out, Margaret quickly hid the paper. In her pillowcase, Nurse Rachel's face appeared in the doorway. Moments later, her practiced smile firmly in place. "Everything all right, Mrs. Winters? I thought I heard voices." "Just talking in my sleep," Margaret replied, matching Rachel's fake smile with one of her own. "You know how it is at my age." Rachel's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course. Sleep well, Mrs. Winters. Pleasant dreams." As the door closed, Margaret clutched her blanket tighter, knowing sleep would not come. In the distance, the singing continued, and now she understood why it sounded like a requiem. It was a death mass for the living, and she was meant to be its next verse. Morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. Breakfast carts rattling down hallways, the cheerful chatter of the day shift nurses, sunlight washing away the shadows of night. But Margaret saw it all differently now. She noticed how certain staff members avoided eye contact, how residents who spoke of strange occurrences would disappear to other facilities, how the sunlight never quite reached certain corners of the building. The paper Eleanor had given her burned like a secret in her pocket as she sat through morning medications, physical therapy, and the mind-numbing routine of senior living activities. She'd memorized its contents in the pale dawn light. A newspaper clipping from 1954, yellowed and brittle. Ravencrest Hospital celebrates breakthrough in longevity. Research Dr. Edward Harrison, Chief of Experimental Medicine, claims unprecedented success in life extension treatments, 20 patients showing remarkable improvements. The article didn't mention the other 100 patients who had disappeared that year, their deaths quietly recorded as natural causes or transfer to other facilities. Margaret had counted the dates, seen the pattern Eleanor had hinted at, deaths, clustering around the full moon, just like they did now. "Mrs. Winters?" Nurse Sarah's voice startled her from her thoughts. "Are you ready for your afternoon walk?" Margaret nodded, grateful it was Sarah pushing her wheelchair today. As they moved through the halls, she studied the young nurse's face. In the reflection of passing windows, Sarah had shadows under her eyes, tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there yesterday. "Sarah," Margaret said quietly as they turned down the east wing, "how long have you worked here?" 3 years next month. Sarah's voice carried a note of wariness. "And in those 3 years, how many patients have died in room 207? Sarah's steps faltered. The wheelchair slowed. I don't remember exactly." 12, Margaret said. "I've been keeping count, all during the full moon, all found in the morning, looking like they'd aged decades overnight." She felt Sarah's hands tighten on the wheelchair handles. Just like at Ravencrest, the wheelchair stopped completely. Sarah moved around to face Margaret, her face pale. "How do you know about Ravencrest?" "I need to see the East Wing storage room." "Mrs. Winters, that area is off-limits to residents." "Sarah," Margaret cut in, her professor's voice emerging from years of disuse. "You've seen things too, haven't you? Things you can't explain. Things that make you pray before entering certain rooms." The young nurse glanced nervously down the empty hallway. "Meet me here, at shift change," she whispered. 4:30. "Most staff will be busy with handover reports." She straightened up as footsteps approached. "And yes, Mrs. Winters, the garden is lovely this time of year." Dr. Harrison rounded the corner, his perfect smile in place. "Ah, Mrs. Winters, Nurse Chen, enjoying our afternoon constitutional. Are we?" Margaret smiled blandly, channeling the doddering old woman they expected her to be. "Oh yes, doctor. Sarah is so kind to an old lady." His smile didn't waver, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. "Sarah, when you're done here, please see Rachel about Mrs. Winters's new medication schedule. We're making some adjustments." After he left, Sarah resumed pushing the wheelchair, her hands trembling slightly. Neither spoke until they reached Margaret's room. "Bus 4:30, Sarah whispered again as she helped Margaret into her chair by the window. "Be careful until then. They're watching." The afternoon crawled by with excruciating slowness. Margaret pretended to doze in her chair, all while watching the staff movements, noting who spoke to whom, who avoided certain areas. She saw Mike arrive early for his night shift, looking exhausted, purple bruises under his eyes. She watched Dr. Harrison make 3 separate trips to the East Wing, each time carrying a different folder. At 4:15, she wheeled herself into the hallway, grimacing at the effort. She'd been practicing in secret, building strength in her arms, refusing to be as helpless as they thought she was. The East Wing was quieter than the rest of the facility, the air noticeably colder. Old photos lined the walls, doctors and nurses from the building's past, their faces stern and unsmiling. One photo caught her eye. Dr. Edward Harrison, 1954. The resemblance to his grandson was uncanny, down to the cold eyes and perfect smile. Sarah appeared exactly at 4:30, keys jingling nervously in her hand. "We have 15 minutes, she whispered, unlocking the storage room door. "The cameras in this section have been malfunctioning since last week's storm." The storage room smelled of old paper and decay. Filing cabinets lined the walls, their metal surfaces dulled with age. Sarah helped Margaret maneuver her wheelchair through the narrow aisles, stopping at a cabinet marked Records, 1950-1959. "This is where I found it," Sarah said, pulling open a drawer. "I was looking for old admission forms to use as templates. Instead, I found this." She handed Margaret a leather-bound journal, its pages warped with age and what looked like water damage. Margaret opened it carefully, her blood running cold as she read the elegant handwriting. Subject 23 showed remarkable cellular regeneration after exposure to the extracted essence. Aging process successfully reversed by approximately 20 years. Subject expired 3 hours post-procedure, but results are promising. The next full moon should provide enough raw material for further testing. "They're still doing it," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "The peaceful deaths in their sleep. They're harvesting something from the patients, life force, soul energy, whatever you want to call it. And Dr. Harrison, he looks exactly like his grandfather did in 1954, exactly the same age." A sound from the hallway made them both freeze. Footsteps, approaching slowly. Sarah quickly helped Margaret hide the journal in her sweater. "We have to go," Sarah mouthed. Silently, pushing Margaret's wheelchair toward the door, they emerged into the hallway just as Dr. Harrison turned the corner. He stopped, his perfect smile never wavering. "Nurse Chen, Mrs. Winters, what a surprise to find you here." "Just showing Mrs. Winters some old photos," Sarah said quickly. "She was asking about the building's history." "How fascinating." Dr. Harrison's voice was smooth as silk, but his eyes were hard as steel. "You know, Mrs. Winters, my grandfather worked in this very building. He was a pioneer in his field, made some remarkable discoveries about the nature of aging. Perhaps we could discuss it sometime over your evening medications." Margaret met his gaze steadily, letting him see the intelligence she usually kept hidden. "I'd be delighted, Doctor. I have so many questions about your family's research methods." Something dangerous flashed behind his eyes. Gone so quickly, she might have imagined it. "Tonight then, after dinner," he turned to Sarah. "Nurse Chen, I believe your shift ended at 4:30. You should go home, rest. Tomorrow may be quite demanding." As they watched him walk away, Sarah's hand found Margaret's shoulder, squeezing gently. "Be careful," she whispered. "I'll try to swap shifts with Rachel. Stay on tonight." Margaret patted the young nurse's hand, feeling the journal's weight against her ribs. "Go home, Sarah. Get some rest. I've faced worse things than Edward Harrison's grandson." But as Sarah reluctantly left and the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Margaret wasn't sure if that was true. In the distance, she could already hear the first notes of that terrible singing beginning to rise. Dinner at Evergreen Pines that evening felt like a macabre performance. Margaret watched Dr. Harrison move from table to table, dispensing gentle smiles and concerned nods, while Nurse Rachel followed with her medication cart. The purple pills had multiplied, Now every residence cup contained at least one. Eleanor's seat remained conspicuously empty. "Mrs. Blackwood is feeling under the weather," Rachel announced when Dorothy asked about her absence. "She's resting comfortably in her room." The slight emphasis on comfortably made Margaret's skin crawl. Dr. Harrison saved Margaret's table for last, pulling up a chair beside her with the practiced ease of a predator settling in for the kill. "Now then, Mrs. Winters, about that chat we discussed. I find your interest in the building's history quite intriguing." Margaret measured her words carefully, aware of the journal hidden in her room. "I've always been fascinated by medical advances, Doctor, particularly in the field of aging research. Your grandfather's work, for instance, achieving cellular regeneration in 1954, would have been revolutionary." Something flickered behind his perfect smile. "Indeed. Though I'm curious how you came across such specific information about his research." "Oh, you know how we elderly love to gossip," Margaret replied, matching his false warmth. "Though I must say, Doctor, you bear a remarkable resemblance to him. The same eyes, same bearing. One might almost think you were the same person." The eye temperature around their table seemed to drop several degrees. "Careful, Mrs. Winters," he said softly, all pretense of warmth vanishing from his voice. "At your age, stress can be so dangerous. Strokes, heart attacks, tragedy can strike at any moment. Nurse Rachel, Mrs. Winters' evening medications, please." Rachel appeared with a paper cup containing 3 purple pills. Margaret took it with a trembling hand, pretending to raise it to her mouth while actually letting the pills fall into the folds of her sweater. "Thank you, Doctor. Your concern for my health is touching. Get some rest, Mrs. Winters. Tomorrow is, after all, a full moon, a time of natural transitions." After he left, Margaret wheeled herself back to her room, her mind racing. She needed to see what happened during the night shift, but the purple pills in residence cups meant they intended everyone to sleep deeply. As darkness fell, she retrieved the small recorder she'd convinced Thomas to bring her months ago to record her memories. Tonight, it would serve a different purpose. At precisely 11 p.m., the night shift began their rounds. Margaret lay in bed, eyes closed, breathing steady, recorder hidden beneath her pillow. The footsteps that entered her room were too light to be Mike's. "Subject appears sedated," a voice whispered. "Rachel's, but with an odd cadence. Proceed with preliminary marking. Cold." Fingers touched Margaret's forehead, drawing what felt like symbols on her skin. The touch sent images flashing through her mind. Surgical theaters filled with shadow, patients screaming as their life force was drawn out through their eyes. Dr. Edward Harrison growing younger as his victims withered into husks. The fingers withdrew. "She's fighting the sedation," Rachel hissed. "Her mind, it's too strong." "The grandfather's research mentioned this," another voice replied. "Dr. Harrison. Some subjects resist the preparation phase. Take her to the basement. We'll begin the procedure early." Rough hands gripped Margaret's arms, and she forced herself to remain limp as they transferred her to a wheelchair. Through slitted eyes, she watched the corridors pass, noting their descent into older parts of the building. The basement air grew increasingly cold, carrying the metallic scent of old blood and something else, something ancient and wrong. They passed through a door marked "Maintenance Only," entering a corridor that couldn't exist within the building's normal dimensions. The walls here were old stone, covered in symbols that hurt her eyes to look at. Dozens of wheelchairs lined the hall, each occupied by a seemingly sleeping resident. "Place her with the others," Dr. Harrison commanded. "The alignment begins at midnight." Margaret felt herself being wheeled into line. To her left, she recognized Mrs. Chen's replacement, a new resident who had arrived just last week. To her right, Eleanor sat straight-backed and alert, her eyes meeting Margaret's in a silent warning. As soon as Rachel and Dr. Harrison's footsteps faded, Eleanor spoke in a bare whisper. "They're preparing for a mass harvest. The symbols they drew, they're binding runes. They think we're all drugged, trapped in our own minds while they drain our life force." How do we stop them? Margaret whispered back. The journal you found. It contains a counter-ritual, but we need... Eleanor broke off as footsteps approached again. Mike appeared at the end of the hall, pushing an empty wheelchair. His face was a mask of misery as he approached an elderly man Margaret recognized from the second floor. I'm sorry, he whispered, helping the unresponsive man into the chair. I'm so sorry. As he passed Margaret's wheelchair, she noticed something odd, a chain around his neck bearing a symbol similar to the ones in the journal. Not a willing participant then, but bound to service through some dark magic. The singing began, echoing through the stone corridors. Dozens of voices chanting in an ancient language that made Margaret's teeth ache. The temperature dropped further, and shadows began to move along the walls, taking shapes that defied sanity. Midnight approaches, Dr. Harrison's voice rang out. The alignment is perfect. Tonight we complete what my grandfather began. Tonight we achieve true immortality. Margaret felt the recorder still pressing against her hip and knew she had to survive to expose this horror. But as the shadows converged and the singing reached a fever pitch, she wondered if survival was even possible in this nightmare beneath evergreen pines. The chanting crescendoed, then stopped abruptly as alarms blared through the building. Code Blue in room 207 crackled over the ancient PA system. Margaret heard Dr. Harrison curse, his footsteps echoing as he rushed away. Now, Eleanor whispered, before they come back. Margaret's arms trembled as she pushed herself up from the wheelchair. Months of secret exercises had rebuilt some strength, but moving in this cold, dark place took extraordinary effort. Eleanor was already standing, surprisingly spry for her age, helping other residents who had fought off the sedation. The far door, Eleanor directed, pointing to a heavy iron portal half hidden in shadow. That's where they keep the original equipment, the records we need. They made their way down the corridor, Margaret's legs threatening to buckle with each step. The walls here were older, the stone blocks bearing deeply carved symbols that seemed to writhe in the dim light. The air grew thicker, carrying the coppery scent of old blood and ozone. Behind the iron door lay a chamber that belonged more in a medieval torture museum than a modern care facility. Rusted surgical tools lined the walls, ancient leather straps hung from examination tables, stained dark with decades of use. But it was the machine dominating the center of the room that drew Margaret's attention. A massive brass and copper contraption bristling with tubes and needles, looking like some Victorian scientist's fever dream. The extractor, Eleanor said, grimly. Edward Harrison's masterpiece. It doesn't just take life force, it transfers it. One subject dies so another can live. Usually takes about 6 victims to restore youth fully. Margaret approached the machine, her academic mind noting details, even as her stomach churned. These markings, they're a combination of alchemical symbols and something older, much older. Eleanor moved to a filing cabinet, pulling out folders with practiced efficiency. The Harrisons didn't invent this process. They found it in texts that should have remained buried. Look. She handed Margaret a leather-bound volume, its pages yellow with age. Margaret opened it carefully, recognizing the elegant handwriting. From the journal in her room, the native peoples spoke of a ritual performed in places where the veil between worlds grows thin. Through proper application of their symbols, combined with modern medical technique, I believe I have perfected what they only glimpsed. The transfer of life essence itself. A sound from the corridor interrupted her reading, shuffling footsteps accompanied by a rhythmic tapping. Margaret and Eleanor ducked behind the extractor as a figure entered the room. It wore a doctor's white coat from another era, but its movements were wrong, jerky like a marionette. As it turned, Margaret saw its face, or rather the absence, of one. Where features should have been, there was only smooth, scarred tissue. The first test subject, Eleanor breathed, the one that showed them it could work. The spirit, for it couldn't be anything else, moved to the extractor, its hands caressing the machinery with terrible familiarity. It began to hum, the same eerie melody they heard at night, but now Margaret could make out words. Life to death to life again, blood and soul in endless chain. What was taken must be paid in the debt that time has made. The temperature plummeted. Margaret's breath came out in white clouds as the spirit turned toward their hiding place. It knew they were there. "Please," a voice rasped from the featureless face. "End it! Break the chain!" Margaret stepped forward, her professor's instincts overriding her fear. "How? Tell us how to stop this." The spirit's hands moved to its smooth face, fingers tracing where its eyes should have been. "The symbols, reverse them. But blood must flow. The price must always be paid." Footsteps echoed from the corridor, human ones this time. The spirit vanished like smoke as Dr. Harrison's voice rang out, "Check every room, find them." Eleanor grabbed Margaret's arm, pulling her toward a hidden door behind the filing cabinets. "The old service tunnels. We can't let them catch us down." Here, they slipped into the tunnel just as voices entered the chamber. Through the crack in the door, Margaret saw Mike enter, followed by Dr. Harrison and Rachel. "They've seen too much," Harrison was saying. "Prepare all marked subjects for immediate processing. No more delays." "Sir," Mike protested, "some of them have family visiting tomorrow." Harrison's hand shot out, grabbing Mike's throat. The orderly rose into the air, feet kicking helplessly. "You forget your place, servant. The binding compels your obedience. Do as you're told." Margaret wanted to stay to learn more, but Eleanor was already pulling her down the tunnel. They moved as quickly as their aged bodies allowed, guided by Eleanor's seemingly perfect knowledge of the layout. "How do you know these passages?" Margaret whispered as they climbed a narrow staircase. "I was a nurse here in 1954. Eleanor's voice was tight with old pain. "I helped Edward Harrison perfect his machine. By the time I realized the true horror of what we were doing, I was already bound to this place. I've spent 70 years trying to atone." They emerged through a panel in the chapel walls, the moonlight through stained glass casting colored shadows across the empty pews. In the distance, they could hear the alarms still blaring. "We don't have much time," Eleanor said, straightening her clothes with shaking hands. "The journal in your room, combined with what we found tonight, it's enough to understand the ritual. And if we understand it, we can reverse it," Margaret finished. She could still hear the spirit's words echoing in her mind. "The price must always be paid." Yes. Eleanor's eyes were hard as steel. "But Margaret, you need to understand. Reversing. The ritual, breaking the chain, it won't just stop them. It will undo everything they've done, every life extended, every death delayed." The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. You'll die." "My dear, I should have died decades ago." Eleanor managed a grim smile. "The question is, are you willing to help me end this, even knowing the cost?" Before Margaret could answer, the chapel doors burst open. Mike stood there, his face a mask of anguish, the binding symbol around his neck glowing with sickly light. "I'm sorry," he whispered. He's making me bring you back." Dawn found Margaret back in her room, her body aching from the night's ordeal. She and Eleanor had barely escaped Mike, using Eleanor's knowledge of the chapel's architecture to slip away through a forgotten confessional booth passage. But they couldn't hide forever. The full moon was coming, and with it the mass harvest Harrison had planned. Margaret pulled out the journal she'd hidden in her pillowcase, cross-referencing it with the papers they'd taken from the basement. Dates jumped out at her, deaths, disappearances, all following a precise lunar schedule. But there was something else, a pattern within the pattern. A knock at her door made her quickly hide the papers. Nurse Sarah entered carrying a breakfast tray and dark circles under her eyes. "Eleanor's gone," she whispered, setting down the tray. "They're saying she had a stroke in the night, was transferred to intensive care, but I checked. No ambulance. Came. No transfer papers filed." Margaret's hands gripped her blanket. "When?" "Just before dawn. Dr. Harrison signed the papers himself." Sarah glanced nervously at the door. "There's something else." I was cleaning room 207 and found this behind the radiator. She slipped a folded paper from her pocket. It was a page torn from a medical file, dated 1954. Margaret recognized Edward Harrison's handwriting. Subject compatibility appears linked to mental acuity. The strongest minds provide the purest essence, but they also resist the process most vigorously. Recommendation: begin cognitive testing of all potential subjects. Note: pay special attention to those with academic or scientific backgrounds. Margaret's blood ran cold as she realized why Harrison had been so interested in her professional background. "Sarah, I need you to help me get into Harrison's office. There will be more files there. Recent ones." "He's in surgery all morning," Sarah said. "Some kind of special procedure in the basement. Rachel's assisting." Her face showed she understood what that really meant. "I can get you in, but we'll only have a few minutes." They moved quickly through the halls, Sarah pushing Margaret's wheelchair with practiced ease. Harrison's office was at the end of the administrative wing, its door bearing a simple nameplate: Dr. James Harrison, Medical Director. Sarah's stolen keycard worked on the first try. Inside, the office was a study in calculated presentation. Degrees on the walls, modern medical texts on the shelves, everything arranged to project professional competence. But Margaret's eyes were drawn to the filing cabinet in the corner, its metal surface marked with familiar symbols. "Keep watch," she told Sarah, forcing herself to stand. Her legs trembled but held as she moved to the cabinet. The lock was old-fashioned, but the pick set Eleanor had given her last night worked perfectly. Inside, she found what she was looking for: current patient files, each marked with strange symbols that matched the ones from the basement. "These are assessment records," she muttered, scanning quickly. "They're rating us, measuring our potential energy output." She found her own file, marked with the highest rating she'd seen. Eleanor's was next to it, bearing a different symbol altogether: 1. That made her eyes hurt to look at. A photo slipped from Eleanor's file, a staff picture from 1954. Margaret's hands shook as she stared at the young nurse standing next to Edward Harrison. Eleanor Blackwood hadn't aged a day until recently. "Mrs. Winters," Sarah's urgent whisper broke her concentration. "Someone's coming." Margaret quickly took pictures of the most important pages with the phone Sarah had smuggled in for her. As she did, a final document caught her eye: a lunar calendar with dates circled in red. Tomorrow night wasn't just a full moon. It was a lunar eclipse. They barely made it out before Dr. Harrison returned, but Margaret's mind was racing with what she'd discovered. The pattern wasn't just about the moon, it was about power. Each eclipse amplified the ritual's effects exponentially. The mass harvest Eleanor had mentioned wasn't just about gathering more life force, it was about performing the ritual at its maximum potential. Back in her room, Margaret laid out everything they'd learned. The ritual worked best on intelligent, mentally active subjects. Eleanor had been part of the original experiments. Possibly the first successful transfer. Tomorrow's eclipse would make the ritual more powerful than ever. Harrison wasn't just continuing his grandfather's work, he was perfecting it, but one piece still didn't fit. She stared at the symbol from Eleanor's file until her vision blurred, and suddenly she understood. It wasn't a rating, it was a binding mark. Eleanor wasn't just helping the victims, she was bound to the ritual itself. Every time it was performed, every life taken added another link to her chains. A commotion in the hallway drew her attention. Through her door's window, she saw orderlies wheeling a covered body toward the service elevator. An arm had slipped free of the sheet, bearing the same watches Dorothy always wore. Another test. "Subject," she whispered. They were practicing, refining their technique for tomorrow night. The thought made her sick, but it also revealed the ritual's weakness. Like any scientific process, it could be corrupted. If they could disrupt the pattern. At its most powerful moment, a shadow passed her door, Mike pushing an empty wheelchair. His face was haggard, the binding symbol on his neck angry and red. As he passed, his eyes met Margaret's, and she saw something there, not just fear or resignation, but a desperate hope. She wasn't the only one looking for a way to break the chains. Night fell over Evergreen Pines, bringing with it the familiar sounds, footsteps, whispers, that haunting melody. But tonight, Margaret heard something else in the singing. Not just death and hunger, but a plea for release. The spirits of Harrison's victims weren't just haunting the building. They were waiting, watching, hoping someone would finally end their torment. Tomorrow, under the eclipsed moon, they would have their chance. The truth hit Margaret like a physical blow as she stared at the documents spread across her bed at midnight. She'd been organizing the evidence, trying to piece together the full scope of Harrison's plans, when she noticed something in the old staff photo that changed everything. It wasn't just Eleanor who appeared in both time periods. There were others. Rachel, Mike, even some of the residents. They weren't just victims or collaborators. They were specimens. Evergreen Pines wasn't simply a continuation of Ravencrest's experiments. It was a carefully controlled breeding ground. Harrison wasn't just harvesting life force. He was cultivating it. Like a farmer rotating crops to maximize yield, he kept some subjects alive through multiple cycles, feeding them the minimal amount of energy needed to sustain them while their own life force grew stronger, richer, more potent. The sound of her door opening made her heart stop. She looked up to find Mike standing there, but something was different. The binding symbol on his neck was gone. "You figured it out, haven't you?" His voice was clearer than she'd ever heard it, lacking its usual nervous tremor. Why some of us never seem to leave. Why Harrison keeps certain residents alive year after year. "You're not really an orderly," Margaret said. "It wasn't a question. I was a quantum physicist before this." 1962. Harrison, the original Harrison, recruited me to help refine the energy transfer process. Said my understanding of particle theory could help stabilize the extraction. He didn't mention that I'd become part of his permanent collection. Margaret's mind raced. The binding symbol only works during the waxing moon, during the waning phase. Some of us can remember, be ourselves again. Harrison knows this, of course. It's part of his system. Let us regain just enough of ourselves to regenerate our essence, make it stronger through our suffering and awareness. The implications were staggering. Tomorrow's eclipse isn't just about maximizing the rituals. "A power," Mike finished. "It's a great culling. Harrison has spent decades breeding the perfect crop of souls, and tomorrow night he plans to harvest them all. The energy release will be enough to make him truly immortal, not just extended. He'll become something other." A sound from the hallway made Mike stiffen. Rachel appeared in the doorway, but her face wasn't wearing its usual false cheer. Her eyes were clear, aware. "They've taken Eleanor to the quiet room," she said without preamble. "Harrison knows she's been fighting the binding. He's preparing her for tomorrow night's ceremony. She'll be the focal point, the conduit for all the harvested energy." Margaret felt sick. She knew. She's known all along that this was coming. Of course she did. Rachel's laugh was bitter. Eleanor was Edward Harrison's wife, the first successful transfer. But something went wrong. The process left her with a conscience, an awareness of what she'd become. She spent decades trying to sabotage their work, save what souls she could. Tomorrow, James Harrison plans to use her guilt, her connection to all the deaths she witnessed, to amplify the ritual's power. "We have to stop it," Margaret said. But Mike was already shaking his head. "You don't understand. We're not just fighting Harrison. Look at the photos again. Look at the building plans." Margaret spread out the blueprints they'd recovered from the basement. At first glance, they showed Ravencrest's original layout, but as she studied them, something impossible became clear. The angles were wrong, the dimensions didn't add up. This wasn't just a building. It was a massive spiritual circuit board designed to channel and amplify supernatural energy. "The whole facility is a machine," she whispered. "Built on a convergence of ley lines," Rachel confirmed. The Native Americans considered this land cursed. The original Harrison didn't choose this location by accident. Every brick, every room, every corridor was placed according to sacred geometry. We're living inside a giant occult processor, and tomorrow night it's going to activate fully for the first time. What happens then? The barrier between life and death breaks down completely, Mike said. Harrison won't just take our life force, he'll trap our souls permanently in this place, creating an endless loop of energy he can feed on forever. The singing started then, but it was different tonight. Clearer. Margaret could understand the words now, and they weren't just a death mass, they were a warning. The spirits weren't just victims, they were trying to tell them something. Rachel cocked her head, listening. They're getting stronger. The approaching eclipse is weakening the barriers already. That's why we can remember, why we can fight the binding. But Harrison knows this too. Whatever we're going to do, it has to be now. As if in response to her words, the lights flickered. Down the hall, someone screamed, a horrible broken sound that cut off abruptly. The temperature dropped, and Margaret watched in horror as dark liquid began seeping from the walls. "It's starting," Mike whispered. "Harrison's beginning the preparation ritual early. He knows we know." The liquid wasn't water or blood, but something worse, pure darkness taking physical form. As it dripped down the walls, it began to form symbols, the same ones from Harrison's files. The whole building was being transformed into a giant binding circle. Rachel grabbed Margaret's wheelchair. "We have to get to Eleanor. She's the key to all of this. If we can free her before the eclipse reaches totality." "You're assuming she wants to be freed," a familiar voice said from the doorway. Dr. Harrison stood there, but he wasn't bothering with his human appearance anymore. His skin was translucent, showing the stolen lives pulsing beneath like captive fireflies. Behind him, the darkness writhed and reached with hungry hands. "My grandfather made many mistakes," he said, his voice echoing oddly. "But his greatest success was creating the perfect partner. Eleanor's guilt, her desperate desire for redemption, has been feeding our work for decades. Tomorrow night, that guilt becomes the catalyst for apotheosis." The darkness surged forward, and Margaret saw Mike and Rachel's binding symbols flare to life. Their faces went blank as the compulsion took hold. She was alone now, facing a monster who had spent 70 years practicing how to harvest human souls. But as Harrison advanced, Margaret smiled, because she'd seen something in Eleanor's file that he hadn't. The original binding ritual had a flaw. It couldn't hold someone who was willing to embrace their guilt completely, who was ready to pay the full price for redemption. And Eleanor, it seemed, had been preparing to pay that price for a very long time. Margaret felt the darkness pressing against her skin as she wheeled herself through the shadowed corridors of Evergreen Pines. Harrison's revelation had changed everything, but it had also given her a weapon: knowledge. The building itself thrummed with unnatural energy, the walls pulsing with stolen lifetimes. She found Sarah in the medical supply room, frantically gathering materials. The young nurse spun around at her entrance, dropping a handful of syringes. "Mrs. Winters, the building, it's changing. The shadows, they're moving on their own, and room 207 just disappeared." "Listen carefully," Margaret said, pulling out Eleanor's journal. "We don't have much time. The binding symbols are weakening because of the approaching eclipse. We need to get to the quiet room before Harrison completes the preparation ritual." Sarah's hands shook as she picked up the fallen syringes. "I saw what they did to Eleanor. They've got her hooked up to machines, drawing symbols on her skin with some kind of black liquid. She's conscious, Mrs. Winters. She's in pain, but she keeps smiling, because she knows something Harrison doesn't." Margaret pulled out the building. "Plans. Look at these blueprints. The facility isn't just built on ley lines. It's built in the shape of an ancient symbol. During the eclipse, it becomes a spiritual amplifier, but amplifiers can be overloaded. A crash from the hallway made them both jump. Through the supply room window, they watched an orderly walk past, or rather float past, his feet several inches off the ground, his eyes completely black. "The barriers are breaking down already," Margaret whispered. "We need to gather everything we can use, salt, iron, anything with symbolic purifying properties. Harrison's been using a corrupted version of Native American rituals. The original protective symbols might still have power." Sarah nodded, her medical training giving way to a deeper, more instinctive understanding. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. "My grandmother was Cherokee. She always said these herbs were for protection against evil spirits. I started carrying them when I first noticed things weren't right here." The building groaned around them, the sound of metal and stone being twisted into new, impossible configurations. The darkness seeping from the walls was forming more complex patterns now, turning the corridors into a maze of writhing shadows. "We need help," Sarah said, stuffing supplies into her pockets. "But everyone else is either bound to Harrison or waiting to be harvested," Margaret finished. "Except Mike and Rachel. The binding only works fully during the waxing moon. Right now they're fighting it, and they're not the only ones." As if in response to her words, the singing began again, but this time it was coming from everywhere at once. The spirits of Harrison's victims growing stronger as the eclipse approached, their voices carrying rage and purpose instead of sorrow. Margaret pulled out the torn page she'd found in Harrison's office, the one detailing the original binding ritual. "The symbols have to be drawn in a specific order, maintained with constant spiritual energy. If we can disrupt the pattern at even one point," the lights flickered, and in the darkness they saw them. Ghostly figures standing in the corridors, former patients and staff, their forms growing more solid with each passing minute. Some bore the marks of the extractor, their faces smooth and featureless. Others showed the wounds that had ended their natural lives. All of them turned their gaze toward Margaret. "They want to help," Sarah whispered. "They've been trapped here so long, watching it happen over and over. Harrison's been using their pain to power his rituals," Margaret said. "But pain isn't the only strong emotion. Eleanor understood that. Hope, love, the desire for redemption, they're just as powerful. If we can channel that energy instead—" She was interrupted by the sound of wheels on linoleum. Dorothy appeared in the doorway, still in her wheelchair, but her eyes were clear and aware. Behind her stood other residents, those who had seemed lost in dementia, now showing sharp, purposeful expressions. "We remember," Dorothy said, her voice stronger than Margaret had ever heard it. "Every full moon, every harvest, every death. We remember, and we're done pretending." The building shuddered. Again, and through the windows, Margaret could see the moon beginning to rise. In a few hours, the eclipse would begin. Harrison would try to complete his grandfather's work, using Eleanor's guilt and decades of harvested souls to transform himself into something monstrous. But he hadn't counted on the strength of those. He'd considered cattle, hadn't realized that every soul he'd bound to this place could become a weapon against him. "Sarah," Margaret said, "get everyone you can to the chapel. The spiritual symbols there might offer some protection." She turned to Dorothy and the others. "We need to disrupt the binding circles Harrison's drawing, break the patterns, smudge the lines, anything to weaken his control." "What about you?" Sarah asked. Margaret gripped her wheelchair's arms, feeling strength flow into her body, strength offered by the spirits gathering around them. "I'm going to the quiet room. Eleanor's been playing a long game, and I think I finally understand her plan. Harrison wanted to use her guilt to power his ritual." She smiled grimly. "Let's show him what else guilt can do." The journey to the quiet room became a nightmare of shifting geometry. Corridors stretched and twisted, doorways appeared where walls had been, and the darkness flowing down the walls had become a living thing, reaching for them with hungry tendrils. Margaret's wheelchair moved with supernatural speed, pushed by unseen hands, as the spirits of Harrison's victims cleared her path. Behind her, she could hear Sarah leading the residents in the opposite direction, their wheels and shuffling feet, accompanied by that haunting melody. No longer a death mass, but a battle hymn. The spirits were teaching them the original words, the true ritual that Harrison had corrupted. Mike appeared at an intersection, his binding symbol flickering like a faulty neon sign. "Harrison's in the basement," he gasped, fighting against the compulsion, preparing the extractor. Rachel's helping him, but she's fighting too. The eclipse, it's affecting everything. Through the windows, Margaret could see the moon rising higher, its edge already beginning to darken. Time was running out. "Show me what they've done to Eleanor," she commanded. The quiet room had once been a storage closet, but now it was something else entirely. The walls had been painted with symbols in that living darkness, forming a spiral that centered on Eleanor's bed. The old woman lay there, covered in more symbols, tubes running from her arms to machines that looked both modern and ancient. But Eleanor was smiling. "Right on time," she whispered as Margaret entered. "James always was predictable, just like his grandfather." "I understand now," Margaret said, wheeling closer. "Why you stayed all these years, why you helped some residents escape while letting others be taken. You were cultivating something too." Eleanor's smile widened. "Hope is such a powerful force, isn't it, all these years, letting my guilt feed their rituals, but transforming it into something else. Every soul I helped escape, every small victory, it changed the energy they were harvesting, corrupted it." The machines around her beeped erratically. The darkness on the walls rippled, responding to something they couldn't see. "Harrison thinks he's going to use my guilt to amplify his ritual," Eleanor continued. 70 years of regret and pain, focused through the eclipse, but guilt can fuel other things. Redemption, atonement, change. A tremor ran through the building. In the distance, they could hear Sarah's voice, leading the others in Cherokee words of protection. The spirits were growing stronger, their forms more solid. "We don't have much time," Mike said from the doorway. "Harrison's coming. He can feel something's wrong." Margaret pulled out the journal, the building plans, the torn ritual pages. "Tell me what to do. Draw new symbols," Eleanor instructed. "Not Harrison's corrupted versions, the original ones. The ones meant to heal, not harm. My guilt isn't just about pain and regret. It's about the desire to make things right." As Margaret began drawing, using a mixture of Sarah's herbs and her own blood, she felt power building in the room. The darkness on the walls recoiled from her marks, revealing glimpses of other places, other times. Ravencrest in its early days, the Native American ceremonies that had once purified this land, Eleanor as a young nurse, realizing the horror of what she'd helped create. The temperature dropped suddenly. The machines flatlined, and in the doorway stood Dr. Harrison, his human form almost completely gone. Behind him, Rachel fought against her binding, tears of blood running down her face. "How clever," he said, his voice echoing with stolen souls. "Using my own grandmother's guilt against me. But you've forgotten something crucial." The darkness surged forward, trying to erase Margaret's symbols. Outside, the moon was nearly covered. "I don't need Eleanor's guilt anymore," Harrison continued. "I have decades of harvested souls, generations of pain and fear. The eclipse will break down all barriers, and I will become—" "Nothing," Eleanor interrupted. Her voice was strong now, resonating with power. "You'll become nothing, James, because I haven't just been feeling guilt all these years." She turned, her head to look at him, and her eyes were glowing with an inner light that made him step back. "I've been remembering what it feels like to be human." Harrison's inhuman laughter filled the quiet room as the eclipse began. Humanity is weakness. Humanity is death. I've spent generations purging myself of such limitations." The darkness around him pulsed, taking shapes that hurt to look. At faces emerging and submerging in waves of shadow, all screaming silently. The stolen souls he'd harvested over decades, their energy twisted and corrupted by his rituals. But Margaret saw something he didn't. In Eleanor's eyes, reflected in the mystical light she emanated, she caught glimpses of other faces, peaceful ones, souls that had escaped over the years, their energy transformed by hope instead of pain. Eleanor hadn't just been saving people. She'd been creating an army. The building groaned as the eclipse deepened, its architectural spellwork activating. The walls became transparent, revealing the spiritual circuitry built into every beam and brick. Lines of power coursed through the structure like veins, all flowing toward the basement where the extractor waited. "Now!" Eleanor shouted, her voice carrying impossible strength. Margaret began the counter-ritual, drawing the final symbols with her blood-herb mixture. Mike and Rachel dropped to their knees as their binding marks flickered and sparked. In the chapel, Sarah's voice rose with the Cherokee protection chant, joined by dozens of others, residents, spirits, souls that had lingered in this place. "Oh, for generations," Harrison snarled, his form expanding, darkness pouring from him like smoke. "You can't stop this. The eclipse is my moment of triumph. All the power I've gathered, all the souls I've harvested, were never yours to take." Eleanor finished. She sat up, pulling the tubes and wires from her arms. Each point where the dark symbols touched her skin began to glow. "I am Eleanor Harrison, wife of Edward Harrison, first successful subject of the life force transfer, and I do not consent to this use of my energy." The building shuddered. The spiritual circuits faltered, their flow disrupted by Eleanor's declaration. Harrison's grandfather had bound her to the ritual, but he'd never considered the power of withdrawn consent, of free will reasserted after decades of apparent submission. Margaret's counter-symbols blazed to life, forming a web of pure light that trapped the reaching darkness. Through the walls, she could see other battles being fought throughout the facility. Dorothy and the residents were erasing Harrison's binding circles with hands that glowed with borrowed power. Sarah's Cherokee chants were awakening older, purer magic in the land itself. "The extractor," Harrison growled, his voice distorting. "Further, if I can't have your guilt, I'll take their fear." He gestured, and the darkness surged toward the basement, toward the waiting machine. "Stop him," Eleanor commanded. The spirits responded, their forms solidifying as they drew power from the eclipse. They flew through walls and floors, racing the darkness to the basement. Margaret's wheelchair moved on its own, carrying her after them. Behind her, she heard Eleanor begin to sing, not the corrupted harvesting song, but something older, purer, a song of healing, of setting things right. They found the extractor pulsing with dark energy, its brass and copper surfaces writhing as Harrison's power fought with the spirits for control. The machine's needles and tubes reached out like hungry mouths, trying to draw in more life force, more souls, to feed its master's transformation. But the spirits were ready. Those who had died in this room, under these needles, surrounded the machine. Their combined energy formed a barrier, keeping Harrison's darkness at bay. Yet Margaret could see it wouldn't be enough. The eclipse was strengthening him too quickly. That's when she saw it, the flaw in the machine's design. Like the building itself, the extractor was covered in symbols, a combination of scientific notation and mystical sigils. But there, at its heart, was a fundamental error. Harrison's grandfather had transcribed one of the Native American symbols incorrectly, creating a weakness in the entire system. Margaret's academic mind, honed by decades of research and analysis, recognized the pattern. The symbol wasn't meant to extract or transfer, it was meant to transform, to take negative energy and purify it, like Eleanor had been doing with her guilt all these years. With trembling hands, she began to redraw the symbol correctly, even as Harrison's darkness pressed closer. Around her, the spirits held their ground, their light flickering but unbroken. Above, Eleanor's song grew stronger, resonating with the very foundations of the building. The eclipse reached totality, and for a moment everything hung in perfect balance, light and darkness, life and death, corruption and redemption. Then Margaret completed the symbol and everything changed. The corrected symbol blazed with white fire, spreading through the extractor's network of tubes and needles like lightning through copper veins. The machine's hum changed pitch, rising from a mechanical growl to something almost musical, harmonizing, with Eleanor's song above. "No!" Harrison's voice shook the room as he realized what was happening. "The energy is mine. The souls are mine." But they weren't. The transformed symbol was doing what it was originally meant to do, purifying, cleansing, setting things right. The darkness surrounding Harrison began to shimmer, and within it, faces emerged, not twisted in pain anymore, but peaceful, awakening. Every soul he'd harvested over decades was being transformed, their energy untangled from his corrupted power. Spirits around the extractor grew stronger, more solid. Margaret recognized some of them now. Former residents whose deaths she'd witnessed, patients from the old photographs, even staff members who'd disappeared over the years. They formed a circle around Harrison, their light containing his writhing. "Darkness, you forget, grandson," Eleanor's voice echoed from above, getting closer. "The original ritual wasn't about stealing life force. It was about transition, about helping souls move on. You and your grandfather corrupted it, twisted it into something horrible. But the truth was always there, waiting." She appeared in a doorway, walking unaided for the first time since Margaret had known her. The symbols on her skin blazed with pure light, and she looked both ancient and ageless at once. "Grandmother, please." Harrison's voice changed, becoming almost human again. "We can share the power, rule this place together. Think of what we could achieve." "I have achieved something," Eleanor cut him off. 70 years of quiet rebellion, 70 years of transforming pain into purpose. Every soul you thought you were harvesting, I was helping to transform. They stayed by choice, growing stronger, waiting for this moment. Margaret's hands moved across the extractor's controls, guided by both academic understanding and spiritual intuition. The machine's power was reversing, its purpose shifting back to what it should have been, not a tool for stealing life, but a gateway for transition. Harrison howled as the spirits pressed closer, their light eating away at his darkness. The souls he'd consumed were breaking free, adding their power to the circle surrounding him. His form fluctuated wildly, young, old, human, monstrous, solid shadow. "It's time to face what you've become," Eleanor said softly. "Time to remember what it means to be human." The eclipse reached its peak above them. The building's spiritual circuitry pulsed one final time, but now it carried Eleanor's song, Margaret's symbols, Sarah's Cherokee chants. Pure energy flowed through the structure, cleansing decades of corruption. Harrison made one last desperate attempt, launching himself at the extractor, but the spirits were ready. As one, they surged forward, their light engulfing him completely. Margaret caught a glimpse of his true form, not a monster, but a frightened boy who'd followed his grandfather's dark path too far. The extractor activated one final time. Harrison screamed as the machine did what it was always meant to do, helped souls transition from one state to another. His darkness dissolved, replaced by simple, human light. The corrupted energy he'd gathered dispersed, transformed by Eleanor's decades of patient work. Around them, the building began to change. The impossible angles straightened, the living darkness retreated, the spiritual circuits faded. Through the walls, Margaret could hear celebrations above. Residents and staff being freed from their bindings, spirits finally able to move on. Mike and Rachel collapsed as their binding symbols dissolved completely. Sarah's voice drifted down, her Cherokee chants becoming a song of thanksgiving. The spirits who had helped them began to fade, their purpose fulfilled, their energies finally clean and free. But Eleanor wasn't celebrating. She stood by the extractor, her light beginning to dim, a peaceful smile on her face. "Eleanor?" Margaret wheeled closer, understanding dawning. "You knew this would happen. The price must always be paid," Eleanor said softly. "I've lived far too long, held on through too many cycles. It's time for me to go, to truly atone for my part in all this." The machine hummed one last time as Eleanor placed her hand on it. Her form began to shimmer, becoming translucent. "Thank you," she said to Margaret, "for helping me finish what I started 70 years ago, for helping me remember what it truly means to be human." With that, Eleanor Harrison, wife, nurse, secret rebel, protector of souls, faded into pure light and was gone, leaving behind a legacy not of guilt, but of transformation and hope. Dawn broke over Evergreen Pines, painting the old building in shades of gold and rose. The eclipse had passed, leaving behind a facility transformed. Where dark symbols had writhed on the walls, now only clean plaster remained. The oppressive weight that had hung in the air for decades had lifted, replaced by a peace that felt both foreign and right. Margaret sat in her wheelchair in the garden, watching ambulances and police cars gather in the parking lot. Sarah had called the authorities. Once it was over, reporting multiple cases of elder abuse and suspicious deaths. The young nurse now moved among the residents, explaining things to paramedics, her Cherokee medicine pouch still hanging proudly at her hip. "They won't believe the whole truth," Mike said, settling onto a bench beside Margaret. He looked older now, but more at peace, the years no longer held artificially at bay. "But they'll find enough evidence of Harrison's crimes to ensure justice is done." Rachel approached, carrying a box of files from the basement. Most of the records survived, dates, names, connections to the original Ravencrest staff. "It's all here." Her hands shook slightly as she set down the box. "Including my real identity. I can finally tell my family what happened to me." The remaining residents were being evaluated by medical teams. Some would need new facilities, others had family being contacted. Dorothy sat regally in her wheelchair, giving a detailed statement to a detective about the unusual medical practices she'd witnessed. Her eyes were clear now, her mind sharp, no longer forced into an artificial fog by Harrison's drugs. "What will happen to this place?" Sarah asked, joining them during a break from her duties. "They'll close it," Margaret replied, thinking of the building plans that now sat safely in her room. Too many questions, too much evidence of wrongdoing, but that's for the best. This land needs to rest, to heal. From the corner of her eye, she caught movement near the tree line. Spirits still lingered, but they were different now, peaceful, preparing to move on. Among them, she glimpsed Eleanor's form, young and vibrant as she had been in 1954, smiling. As she faded into the morning light, a commotion at the front entrance drew their attention. Thomas and Sarah, Margaret's children, rushed from their cars, faces drawn with worry. They'd finally answered the multiple messages left by the police. "Mom!" Thomas reached her first, his corporate polish cracking with genuine concern. You all right? They said something about patient abuse, about Dr. Harrison." "I'm fine," Margaret cut him off, steel entering her voice. "Though I'd be better if you'd listened to me months ago about the strange things happening here." Sarah, her daughter, had the grace to look ashamed. "Mom, we thought, with the stroke, that I was losing my mind," Margaret finished. A common assumption about the elderly, one that Harrison counted on, in fact, but we'll discuss that later. She turned to Mike and Rachel. "Right now, these people need help documenting their stories, their real stories. Understanding passed between them. The full supernatural truth would remain their secret, but the human crimes, the abuse, the negligence, the mysterious deaths, those would be brought to light." They worked through the morning, giving statements, providing evidence, ensuring every resident was properly cared for. Margaret watched it all with a professor's eye for detail, knowing that justice, like healing, sometimes required patience and precision. 3 weeks after the eclipse, Margaret stood at the gates of Evergreen Pines one last time. Yellow police tape crossed the entrance, and official notices detailed the facility's closure and ongoing investigation. The building looked smaller. Somehow, its dark presence diminished to mere brick and mortar. The story had made national news. Elder care facility closed after decades of systematic abuse. Harrison's disappearance was attributed to suicide, his body presumed lost in the vast forest behind the property. The truth of his transformation would remain known only to those who had witnessed it. "Ready to go, Mrs. Winters?" Sarah asked, helping Margaret into her daughter's car. The young nurse had found a position at a nearby hospital, but still made time to check on the displaced residents. Her Cherokee grandmother now conducted monthly cleansing rituals on the grounds, ensuring the land's dark history would never repeat. Mike and Rachel had finally been able to contact their long-lost families, their stories of awakening from comas accepted as medical mysteries. They'd grown older rapidly once freed from Harrison's influence, but they faced their natural aging with dignity, grateful to experience life's normal rhythms again. "The new facility has an excellent rehabilitation program," Margaret's daughter said from the driver's seat, her doctor's authority tempered now with genuine respect. "And it's only 10 minutes from my house. No more excuses for missed visits." As they drove away, Margaret caught one last glimpse of the building in the rearview mirror. For a moment, she thought she saw Eleanor standing at an upstairs window, young and radiant, offering a final farewell. Then the image faded, and Evergreen Pines became just another abandoned building, its dark purpose transformed into a testament of human resilience and the power of redemption. 1 month later, Margaret sat in her new room at Sunrise Valley Care Center, arranging her belongings with purpose. Her doctorate hung proudly on the wall, no longer gathering dust. Her books filled the shelves, psychology texts mixed with volumes on Cherokee spirituality that Sarah had gifted her. The room felt alive, sunlight streaming through large windows that actually opened. On her desk, a journal lay open, its pages filled with her careful documentation of the Evergreen Pines incident, not for publication, but for preservation. Some truths needed to be remembered, even if they couldn't be widely shared. Dorothy had taken a room down the hall, her mind remaining sharp since their escape. They met for coffee every morning, speaking in careful codes about their shared experience. Other survivors had scattered to different facilities, but they stayed in touch through a support group Sarah had organized. On the surface, they discussed recovery from elder abuse. In private, they shared deeper healing. Mike and Rachel visited weekly, their rapidly aging faces bearing peaceful smiles. They'd found freedom in finally living their natural lifespans, in feeling time move as it should. They brought news of others, the police investigation, the families of past victims finding closure, the slow demolition of Evergreen Pines. But most importantly, Margaret's room contained something that would have been impossible at Evergreen Pines: hope, pure and uncorrupted, like the first light of dawn after the longest night. Sometimes during the full moon, Margaret would wake to find her room filled with a soft, familiar light. Not the corrupted glow of Harrison's rituals, but something pure, like Eleanor's final transformation. On these nights, she'd see shapes in the moonlight, peaceful spirits checking on their allies, making sure the darkness stayed at bay. She kept track of similar facilities through newspaper clippings and internet searches. Sarah helped her identify patterns, unexplained deaths, mysterious transfers, administrators with familiar names. The Harrisons hadn't been the only ones to discover these dark rituals. But now there were people watching, remembering, ready to recognize the signs. Dorothy had started teaching art therapy at Sunrise Valley, her classes surprisingly popular among new residents. Few realized that the symbols she incorporated into her designs were protective sigils, subtle barriers against malevolent forces. The building's walls gradually accumulated these innocent-looking decorations, creating a shield of light and hope. Mike and Rachel spent their remaining time documenting their experiences in letters to be delivered to their families after their deaths, natural deaths this time, approaching with dignity. Their stories would serve as warnings, carefully coded, but clear to those who needed to understand.